welcome to the 5th lecture of the cryptocurrency Decal. We're going to be talking about mining today, and we have with us Carl Dong, like a guest lecturer. Would like to introduce yourself real quick, Carl?
Hi, I'm Carl, like the llama, and I work at 21 right now. We're a well-funded Bitcoin startup. Other than that glorified SQL, database that is Coinbase. So yeah, I'll be talking about mining right here, and just feel free to ask any questions. Like if you don't understand anything, if you want me to repeat anything, just ask me, and I'll happily do so. And yeah.
Carl's going to be giving the main portion of our lecture, and I'll cap it off with some interesting ideas section, which is going to be a little more miscellaneous. So let's get started.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So, okay, everybody. Okay, Facebook open. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So everybody knows this, right? Like the profit from anything is just the reward minus the cost. This should be pretty obvious, right? Or else you really shouldn't be in Cal. So profit equals reward minus cost, right? So what this actually means is that if the reward is more than the cost, then you make money, right? This is a very simple. It's a very simple argument. So how does this relate to Bitcoin mining? So today we're going to get into the mind of a Bitcoin miner and see, how they make their money, right? So let's do this. So the analogy in Bitcoin is that if the mining reward is more than the mining cost, then the miner will profit. And today we're going to be breaking down mining reward and mining costs into these four little things: the block reward, the transaction fee, the hardware cost, and the operating costs. So let's start off with block reward. So I'm sure you guys have already been through the lectures about how proof of work works and everything. So I want to draw an analogy, and the analogy I draw is that proof of work in the Bitcoin network is just like shooting an arrow onto a target, right? If you get within, so the analogy is such that if you get within this yellow circle, then it's a valid block. If you get outside of this yellow circle, it's an invalid block. Because remember, and I'm sure you've seen this so many times in your book before, the hash of the combination of the nonce and the previous hash and all these transactions has to be below the target for it to be a valid block. So what we can think of when the miners are doing their SHA-256 is they're just shooting arrows blindly at this target. Right? And nobody's better than anybody else at doing it. However, what you can do is you can just shoot more arrows per second to make sure that you would get, there's more of a possibility within a time frame that you end up with a valid block. Well, but however, one of the goals of Bitcoin is that you want the whole network to have validated one block within 10 minutes, right? So how do you do that if people keep on increasing the speed at which they try to hit the target? So the way you do that is very simple. You just decrease the size of the yellow circle, right? So when miners, their hashing speed gets boosted, right? They buy their new hardware, their shiny new hardware, and they can hit more things on the target. Then what you do is you decrease the yellow circle, making it harder for them to hit the target. So that is what we call difficulty adjustment. And difficulty adjustment is something that happens roughly every 2 weeks. And you can take, and it really happens every 2016 blocks. And 2016 is not because we're in the year 2016. 2016 is because that is exactly how many 10 minutes there are in 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks we have this difficulty adjustment. What that means is that, hey, it looks at the previous 2016 blocks and say, okay, did the network finish these 2016 blocks below 2 weeks or above 2 weeks? If they finish it below 2 weeks, that means that they're getting good, right? They're really getting good at hitting this target. So let's shrink the yellow circle a little bit to make it harder for them to hit inside. However, if it took them more than 2 weeks to mine these 2016 blocks, then we know that the puzzle is getting too hard for them to solve. It's getting hard for them to hit within this yellow circle. So we expand the yellow circle a little bit to account for that, right? So that is difficulty adjustment. And that makes sure that a block is mined every 10 minutes. So another aspect of block rewards is Bitcoin halving. Every currency we have on Earth right now that you would know about, like the US dollar, the Japanese yen, the euro, everything is an inflationary currency. And they're an inflationary currency simply because they have some sort of Federal Reserve where they can print unlimited amount of money. However, that is not the case in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is actually capped at 21 million. And so, and how do we cap that? Everybody who knows about geometric sums know that if the ratio is less than 1, then the limit to infinity will have some sort of, will converge to some number, right? So with Bitcoin halving, it means that every block that the miner mines, right now we have 12.5 Bitcoins. For every block that they mine and gets validated by the network, they get a reward of 12.5 Bitcoins. However, every 4 years, we're going to decrease that number by a half. And it just happens such that this block reward halves and halves and halves and halves, meaning that the Bitcoin will converge to 21 million. And then you won't be able to produce any more Bitcoins after 21 million. Well, a very simple question arises. What are the miners' incentives to keep maintaining the network after Bitcoin has reached 21 million? And that is what we're going to talk about next. So we just talked about block reward, and now we're going to talk about transaction fees. And transaction fees are a small amount of fees that you tack on to your transaction every time that you send money to someone, right? And so transaction fees are actually optional in the Bitcoin ecosystem. You can send a transaction with 0 transaction fees. However, when the miners collect all the transactions that they see, they're going to prioritize the ones that have higher transaction fees, right? Because they're out there to make money, right? So miners tend to favor transactions with larger transaction fees per byte. And we can see here, well, it's not very clear to you guys, but I'll show you. So on this side, we have Satoshis per byte. So that is the transaction fee, right? So if you don't give any transaction fee, if your transaction fee is 0, the time for your transaction to be actually included in the blockchain and validated is going to be 120 minutes to infinity, which means you might send money and nobody will ever get it, right? So that's really bad because and the reason is because the miners, they want higher transaction fees. So you can see that as the transaction fees increase, the time to confirmation, the time until your block gets into the blockchain is going to decrease, right? And you can find an optimal number here. So this is going to be the primary source of revenue for miners after 21 million Bitcoins, and of course 21 is because of that 21. Anyhow, so we just finished transaction fees. Now let's talk about mining costs, and specifically let's talk about hardware cost. Right? We're earning so much right now. However, we still need to give some investment in order to earn the mining reward that we were talking about before. So hardware costs, you can see here. We have CPUs, GPUs, FPGAs, and ASICs, and those are four generations of hardware that people have used to mine Bitcoin. And you can see here that there was the CPU era, GPU, ASICs. The FPGA was a very, very short era, and I'm assuming that's why it's not here right now. And yeah, let's investigate each one of them. So for CPU mining, everybody has their computer. Every computer has a CPU. So technically, you could be mining Bitcoin. Well, actually, you can mine Bitcoin by hand, but I don't recommend doing that. But you could actually start mining right now on your laptop. However, you can see that the time to first block is like 300,000 years. So unless we get singularity going, this is really not going to happen. So You guys know about the nonce thing, incrementing the nonce and everything. So basically, the CPU is a very linear process. So for each nonce, it's just going to run SHA-256, right? And then check if it was a valid block, as in if it was within that yellow circle. And if it is, it submits it to the network, etc., right? It's slowest. It's what Satoshi Nakamoto used when he first started out, because hey, he didn't really need, the difficulty was really high, right? Think about it. The yellow circle was like all the way out there. He could just like shoot however he wanted, and he got a valid block. And it's been the difficulty has been shrinking since. And of course, you can do this on your computer because every computer has a CPU. Next, we have GPU mining. GPU mining, because GPUs are designed for parallel computation, you can technically calculate the SHA-256 for a bunch of nonces at once, right? And it is an order of magnitude faster than CPUs. As you can see here, CPUs take forever, GPUs take a little less than forever. They consume a lot of energy, it produces a lot of heat, and me and Max, we were just super nerdy back in high school, so this is like what we did all day. And back in the days, it was $450 for the R9290s. The R9290s were state of the class back then. Yeah, so that's what worked when me and Max were in high school. But we have progressed a lot since then, and I'll show you how.
You want to talk a little more about GPU mining?
Oh my God. Okay. Yeah. So GPU. Okay. So GPU mining used to be this craze. Like it was like early 2014. Yeah, early 2014 was the craze for GPU mining. There was actually a manufacturer called ASRock, and ASRock designed these motherboards that had one CPU and 6 lanes for GPUs. So I bought one of those. I bought a whole ton of GPUs. I slapped them on, annoyed the fuck out of my dorm mates. But hey, I got free electricity because I was in the dorm room, right? And I just like kept mining those Bitcoins, and that was really fun. Yeah, I sold most of it now. Oh God. Oh, I feel old. Okay, all right, there we go. Okay, so FPGA mining. So field programmable gate arrays. So well. One thing that kind of applies to life as in technology is that when you specialize, you can be more efficient, right? And we see here that we're getting more and more specialized, and FPGAs are a more specialized version of a CPU. They can be programmed to do a very limited number of things. And you can see this as a trade-off between ASICs and general purpose CPUs. And moving on to today, and you can see that all of these take, more than your lifetime, so you're just not going to get a block at all, right? You have to join a pool, but the last thing that we want to see, and this is what we use today, this is what miners today use, is called ASICs. They're application-specific integrated circuits. So they are circuits where down to the last wire, the transistors, they're all designed specifically to mine Bitcoin, specifically to do SHA-256. And they're very expensive to produce because you have to design the whole thing. It's like designing your own CPU, but just for Bitcoin mining. However, they are the fastest miners around. For example, this one can do 10 trillion hashes per second. Costs around $1,600 right now to buy one of these, and the time to block is 22 days. So you only need 22 days to get a valid Bitcoin block. So that is freaking amazing for professional miners. Okay, all right. So the last bit, operating costs. So a lot of energy is actually used in the Bitcoin network, right? We have embodied energy, which means the energy that was used to produce those mining hardware. We have electricity that's used for every electronic thing that you have to plug into the wall, including these miners. And you also have to have electricity for cooling, because as you know, anything that runs at full capacity is going to give out a lot of heat. We also have, and I believe this is in your book, the thermodynamic limit of something's principle. So what this equation, this equation entails is that every time you have an operation, that incurs loss of information. Per bit of information that you lose, you're going to have to put in this much energy, right? So if you think about a perfect Bitcoin miner, a perfect Bitcoin mining machine, you can essentially multiply this by the amount of bit that's lost through its ASIC process and come up with an equation for how much energy it's going to expend. I also want to talk about the energy usage of the entire Bitcoin network. If you didn't know before, the Bitcoin network is the most powerful supercomputer in the world by far. Its hashing rate is around 2 billion gigahashes per second. Now let's just do some very simple calculations, right? The most powerful ASIC miner right now is 14,000 gigahashes per second, and it operates at 1375 watts, right? And just taking this ratio and extrapolating here, we can see that the Bitcoin network expends 178 million watts, which is about a tenth of the energy of a large coal-fired plant, which in the grand scheme of things really doesn't mean that much. However, I believe it is a very efficient way to lock down assets, because you understand that billions of dollars of worth of assets are on the Bitcoin network right now, and it's resistant to double spending, to 51% attacks and everything. The last thing I want to talk about is that, hey, mining Bitcoin can actually be an electric heater that makes you money. Somebody actually did the calculation for this. They were like, okay, so say that we ran the Bitcoin mining program on your computer, right? And then say that we just have an electric heater. What is the energy efficiency of both of them in terms of heating your house up? And it turns out to be the same. So next time you want to buy a heater, just start mining Bitcoin. Anyhow, okay, that's my portion of the lecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. All right, so now I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the innovative proof of work ideas. So there's a number of different requirements for proof of work if you want to design some alternative algorithm to use as a consensus mechanism. There's a few requirements. First, it needs to be quick to verify. This is kind of obvious. We keep on going over like the hash thing. And the chance of winning the puzzle should be proportional to the amount of computational power that you have. And it should also be memoryless, meaning that that if you have more computational power than someone else, you should still only have a proportional chance of actually getting that that power. If it's not memoryless, then you run into an issue where big miners will have a steep advantage over smaller miners because they'll be able to look at those solutions faster. Bitcoin's puzzle is something called a partial hash pre-image puzzle, where it's partial hash pre-image because, like, okay, we've specified we need to find a hash output that has this number of leading zeros, and that's your answer. Okay, so taking along that basic framework for looking at consensus algorithms, proof of work algorithms, let's look at a few other desirable characteristics. So first we have ASIC resistance. There's a few reasons why you want to have ASIC resistant. Typically in the community, or if you're just using Bitcoin, you're transacting, but you're not going to actually own any mining hardware because it's so specialized. So this cuts out all the people in the ecosystem from participating in the mining and the consensus and the transaction validation process. Instead, it's under the control of a bunch of Chinese miners. Little side conspiracy note, China used to be really against Bitcoin, and like Bitfury was analyzing like Chinese miners. They're like, there's no way they're profitable. How are they profitable? And like, notice that China is now like kind of pro Bitcoin. Like, oh, this is okay. Like, does this mean that China now controls Bitcoin? Anyways, it's also being ASIC resistant also means it's more democratic, more decentralized. The original Satoshi white paper brought up this notion of one CPU, one vote. But nowadays, it's not quite that decentralized. It's very centralized now, which could be a problem. There's actually some arguments against ASIC resistant as well. Because when you have an argument or an algorithm that is ASIC, it actually makes the cryptocurrency more secure. Suppose some attacker managed to acquire a bunch of hashing power and had over 51% of the network. If they attack the network and they want to kill Bitcoin, well, suddenly they have, after their attack, they have a bunch of useless hardware that literally can't be used for anything else. We keep on saying, we built the most powerful computer in the world, but the only thing that it can do is SHA-256. With an ASIC algorithm, this prevents an attacker from renting Amazon EC2 instances, launching a giant attack, and then after the fact just be free of any consequences. They had to put up a huge financial investment, infrastructural investment, a logistical investment in order to acquire that amount of hash power in the first place. Then maybe China does it. Okay, one approach to ASIC resistant is to have memory hard algorithms. In a nutshell, it just means that the time that you use to access and manipulate the memory is much greater than the time that you actually spend computing values. And this helps ASIC resistance because CPUs are generalized, and it's a lot of arithmetic calculations. We are able to optimize ASICs simply because hashing algorithms use a very specific or small subset of what CPUs can actually do. With memory, it's also increases the rate at which the industry improves the performance of memory is a lot slower than CPU. There's Moore's law or whatever, but even though Moore's law might not be true anymore. So in theory, if we have a coin that's memory hard and ASIC resistant, the cost of mining any particular problem, the efficiency, I should say, will only decrease slowly over time, which will have more stability. And we'll get to look at one famous example of a memory hard algorithm, and this is called Scrypt. So if you've heard of Litecoin or Dogecoin, both of them use Scrypt. And it was originally designed for hashing passwords. They wanted to make it really, really hard to brute force and to run this algorithm a bunch of times. So let's look at how Scrypt actually works. Essentially what you do is you allocate a memory buffer, and you have some seed. And that seed is that consensus information that we need, right? So we need the previous block header, we have the Merkle root, and we're incrementing some knots. And those together make up the seed. And you fill up the first block of memory with this seed data, and then you hash that and put that into the next block. You hash that, put that into the next block. So what you've essentially created is this chain of interdependent data that you can compute on the fly. And then after you've created this memory buffer, you're going to access this data in a pseudo-random way. So pseudo-random means it's deterministic, but it's also essentially random. So you keep on querying this bit of memory until you return some value, and that value needs to be less than the target difficulty. So you can see that this requires memory hardness because okay, suppose we wanted to compute values on the fly. If I wanted to look for a V of 6 or something, then I could still take that seed value and hash it 6 times. But that's a lot less efficient than directly accessing the memory. So this is why we can say, okay, Scrypt is actually memory hard. But some drawbacks to that, first, it requires just as much memory to verify as it does to compute this hash. It could be it's not too big of a problem because to verify, you only need to run this algorithm once. The only limitation is that you can only increase that n parameter. You can only increase the size of the memory buffer so much before you run into some limits with general computing hardware on your phone or laptop or whatever. And the second problem is that Scrypt actually isn't ASIC resistant anymore. ASICs have been developed for it since 2015. And yeah, the general theme for ASICs is it's an arms race. We'll see more. Any questions about Scrypt? All right. There's some other approaches as well. So one of the popular but also not very scientific approaches is let's just take 13 hashing algorithms and chain them together and make it a huge bit to make any kind of ASIC for it. But the problem is it's actually been done. So as of February of this year, Dash, which is a coin that uses X13, someone created an ASIC that has 11 hashing algorithms, all within that one chip. That's a huge amount of complexity, but it's still possible. Another idea is to periodically change the mining puzzle. So say there's roughly 24 strong cryptographic hash functions right now. We can say that every 6 months or so, we're going to change to a new algorithm. But that's not really effective because, say, for example, if you knew the schedule of algorithms that you're going to use and you're a hardware manufacturer for ASICs, you can simply create these ASICs just in time for that new algorithm to start, and you still have an ASIC coin. The overall conclusion to draw from this is basically what Mike Hearn famously said. There's really no such thing as an ASIC-resistant algorithm. One of the prerequisites for a cryptocurrency to be ASIC is that it needs to have a high enough market cap and enough belief that this coin is going to succeed in the future, and enough mining reward. So long as that mining reward exists and there's some algorithm that's not extremely complex or Turing complete or whatever, then you're going to have ASICs developed for it. Any questions? Yeah.
Is there any reason that you can rechain either 11 or 13 hash functions together? Wouldn't it be possible to chain 600 to make it really difficult to use?
Yeah, it is, but it's those are still just order of magnitude. And I'm pretty sure there's only about 24 cryptographic hash functions that are actually secure. It's really hard to come up with these functions. Yeah. Another idea is you could take these 13 hash functions and keep on permuting them, and according to this schedule. But that was just something that I came up with today. Yeah.
Aren't ASICs pretty inefficient when you have 13 hash functions though? That's a lot of physical silicon space you need for those dedicated pipelines. The amount of parallelism you get would be lower.
Yeah.
For the chip area.
Yeah. I think that it would be less efficient, but it's still way more efficient than using GPUs or CPUs or FPGAs or whatever. Yeah.
And if you have FPGAs, can't you just whenever they change cryptographic hash functions, you can reprogram them, right? So
yeah, exactly.
You're screwed no matter what.
Yeah, exactly. That's why the changing the mining puzzle hasn't actually been implemented in practice. Yeah. All right. Okay. So we talked about how we waste so much energy with Bitcoin. One way to get around that is to recycle this energy in a way by using this computational power for something that's actually useful. So in this table, you can see some examples of distributed computing projects. There's the Great Internet Mersenne prime search, which found the last 14 largest prime numbers. You can find aliens using the data from SETI at home. You can help out humanity by helping run atomic level simulations of protein folding and try to detect defective proteins or whatever. That I don't know anything about biology. If you're really ambitious, you can try to create a predictive climate model that takes all the data that we have from climate and repeatedly crunches. I don't know, maybe it's machine learning or something. And then SolarCoin isn't distributed computing, but it's just another cryptocurrency idea. The idea behind SolarCoin is okay, you have these solar manufacturers. Let's incentivize them to produce more renewable energy by rewarding them with SolarCoin. That's just one example of something you can do. So, oh, that's cut off. Okay. So what are the challenges you can what are the ways in which you can implement proof of useful work? It's actually really hard, it turns out. And most of the problems that you just saw on the table are unsuitable. So for example, with study at home, this is a basic issue, but there's a fixed amount of data that you have to crunch on. Like if there's enough economic incentive behind the cryptocurrency that you're trying to use proof of useful work on, then it's very feasible that you're going to run out of data, and it's going to be missing something called an inexhaustible puzzle space. Second, typically when you use distributed computing, you have some central entity that says, okay, you do this amount of work, you do this amount of work, you look over here for aliens, you look over here. But with a cryptocurrency, you can't rely on anything centralized. And so long as you have any kind of heuristic as to, okay, this area is more likely to contain aliens and more likely to contain a block reward, you're gonna violate that property, which is the chances of getting the block reward should be proportional to your computational power. Because when you have this heuristic, all the miners are going to go to this part to search first. And what's going to happen is all the fastest miners are going to find that solution first, consistently. And it's also going to be memoryless because the miners that have worked on this part of the solution space the longest have the highest chance of actually finding it. Yeah, you had a question? Okay. So yeah, basically it hasn't been done except for something called proof of storage. So there's something called permacoin, and that basic idea is you're able to use this cryptocurrency to back up some really large, important file. And one example of that is like the experimental data from the Large Hadron Collider, which is hundreds of petabytes, I believe. Yeah. And presumably it's not something that any individual can store. So what if you create an incentive to store this? So how do you do this? We keep on talking about Merkle trees. You take this giant file, you break it up into like billions of blocks or whatever, and then you create a giant Merkle tree, and then that Merkle root is now the summary of this file. The network only has to agree on this Merkle root in order to achieve consensus. Now, as a miner, what you do is you can't store all of the files, right? So you store only a subset of them. And the subset that you store is based off of a public-private key pair that you generate. Now, when you're trying to solve the puzzle, you take your consensus information and you, like the previous block header, Merkle root, and your knots, you hash those together, and the output is something that determines which of the blocks you have stored locally that you will pick for another round of hashing. So essentially, that's really complex, but like your public key determines what blocks you hold, and the consensus information determines what blocks you actually pick of the ones that you hold. Now that you have the blocks picked, you hash them all together, and then if that hash output is less than the target, then you have found a valid block. It's very convoluted, but you can see that it proves that you have actually stored this amount of data, because every time you increment the knots, you're basically choosing a different subset of the blocks you have stored locally to hash together. And if you were not storing these blocks locally, you would have to query the network, which is much more inefficient. Like if you had to do that at every single nonce. And once you find the solution, you basically need to publish the blocks that you have that found the solution and the Merkle root up, the Merkle branch up to the Merkle root. So that's why we have some limits on these parameters, k, because every time you find a valid block, you need to publish k log n of data to the blockchain. Yeah. Yeah, any questions about that? All right. Okay. And then this isn't a proof of work consensus algorithm, but this is a related concept. So there's something called merge mining. When you launch an altcoin, you need hash power to secure your network. And the problem is that this mining is exclusive by default. Say I wanted to launch a new altcoin that also used SHA-256. When I'm mining blocks in Bitcoin and mining blocks on my altcoin, they're solving different problems. So I can't use the computing resources for both things. And what this creates is a competition for hash power. But by mining my altcoin, I can no longer gain profits on Bitcoin. This creates something called altcoin infanticide, where in many cases, because Bitcoin's so huge compared to these tiny little altcoins, the hash rate of an individual miner or an individual mining pool on Bitcoin can completely dwarf the entire hash rate of an entire cryptocurrency. So one example of this was in 2012, there was this mining pool called Eligius, and the pool operator thought that Coiled Coin was a scam. So what he did was, he has control of all of this computational resources. He directed it at Coiled Coin and mined a bunch of empty blocks and essentially destroyed the cryptocurrency, because once you erase days of transactions and have all this false data on the blockchain, you can no longer trust that this cryptocurrency has any kind of value. So one way to get around this issue is to introduce merge mining. The basic idea is you want to be solving both problems at once, and you want to be trying to create blocks for both Bitcoin and your altcoin at the same time. That's how you can share this hash power. And to implement this, it's pretty easy for the altcoin, because as an altcoin, all you need to really implement is some consensus mechanism, some way to make sure that it's secure. But how do you include these altcoin transactions in Bitcoin? The solution is to create a summary of these altcoin transactions, and you guys are very familiar that a summary of these transactions is the Merkle root. You can take the Coinbase parameter in Bitcoin, which can accept any arbitrary data, and basically mine Bitcoin blocks while storing this altcoin Merkle root in the Coinbase parameter. It's all valid to the other Bitcoin clients because they don't care what the Coinbase parameter is, but to your altcoin nodes, they're going to see these Bitcoin blocks with the Merkle root and say, okay, yes, this was validated, this was in the Bitcoin blockchain. This essentially creates two parallel chains with links to each other, and I think the best way to illustrate that is through this diagram. So up here we have the Bitcoin blockchain, and we have altcoin blockchain, and we have all the people on the altcoin are trying to mine Bitcoin as well. So there will be some blocks where it meets the altcoin's difficulty target, but not Bitcoin's difficulty target. And that's because for most instances of altcoins, you want to have a block time that's faster than once every 10 minutes. Bitcoin's is very slow compared to all the other cryptocurrencies. And in order to have that faster block time, you need a lower difficulty, right? So you'll have this phenomenon where if you find a Bitcoin block, it satisfies the difficulty requirements of both coins, but sometimes you'll have it only satisfy the altcoin difficulty requirement. There's also cases where, maybe if you wanted really, really slow blocks, the difficulty could actually be higher than that of Bitcoin, and you would have Bitcoin blocks. You would be able to mine Bitcoin blocks that don't make it as an altcoin block. That's a little more interesting. But essentially, you can think of these Bitcoin blocks tainted green as containing a Merkle root of the altcoin transactions. And there will be some cases where, we mine multiple altcoin blocks that didn't meet the Bitcoin requirement, but in this next Bitcoin block that the altcoin miners found, you include the Merkle root of these two, together. You could hash them together or something, and you've essentially created a secure chain. Any questions? All right. Okay, so for next week, we're going to be covering alternative consensus and enterprise blockchain. So the readings are pretty heavy, so I would get started on them soon. The first one is actually a comic book, or a comic. It's supposed to be an easy introduction into this next Medium post that is a summary of the Stellar Consensus Protocol. We're going to be diving deep into Byzantine consensus, Byzantine fault tolerance, what federated Byzantine agreements mean. It's going to be a lot of jargon. Right here, this is on public and private blockchains. So earlier we've said that from a technological standpoint, private blockchains aren't that interesting. Ethereum, Vitalik, the founder of Ethereum, wrote a pretty cogent and great explanation of the differences between public blockchains and private blockchains, so that in any conversation today, like where everyone's all hyped about blockchain, you'll know the technical undergrounding of it. And then lastly, optional is provably secure proof-of-stake protocol. Proof-of-stake is a way to achieve consensus without having some kind of proof of work, some kind of computational power. And it's actually hotly debated because a lot of people say, oh, you can't have security without expending some kind of real-world resource. But apparently someone on the 12th of this month came out with a paper that's provably secure. So if you wanted to read that, it's pretty interesting. Yeah, question?
Can you go back to the altcoin?
What?
Can you go back to the altcoin?
Yeah. Here?
So these so the altcoin blocks are a part of the Bitcoin blockchain too, right?
Yeah. Well, the altcoin transactions would be summarized in a Merkle root, which is in a Bitcoin block.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't.
Or actually, yeah, continue.
So it doesn't cause any forks or anything, right? It's just the Merkle root.
Yeah, it's just the Merkle root. Like to all the other Bitcoin miners, like they don't care what's happening. And in fact, if they notice that this altcoin is like merge mining with Bitcoin, then they should probably also be merge mining that altcoin as well. Otherwise, they're losing out on like potential profits. Yeah.
So let's see. So what I'm wondering is like, I mean, I think intuitively it makes sense, but like exactly how does this prevent Bitcoin miners from like basically breaking the altcoin arbitrarily?
Because you have a lot of computational power on this altcoin. I don't know if I can explain it like good enough, but the issue is that with Bitcoin, because it's so much bigger than these altcoins, like you have individuals that can destroy entire altcoins. When you increase the hash rate of an altcoin to that of Bitcoin, or even greater, then you can mitigate that risk. And I talked about coiled coin as like an example of like, oh, this is why we need to solve this problem. But like, if you actually read in the textbook, coiled coin was merge mining with Bitcoin. Yeah. So I can't quite give like the best security explanation why, but yeah, feel free to talk to me after. Yeah. Any more questions? Last call, or hold your peace. All right, thank you guys. See you next week.